Hola, muy buenas tardes. Con el gusto saludarlos de GAQSA TV y como siempre con la intención de traer a ustedes información práctica, información que se aplique directamente en los establos para mejorar sustentabilidad y también rentabilidad. Y el día de hoy realmente nos sentimos muy orgullosos, muy complacidos de tener la visita de Luis Ferrerato. Luis estudió, tuvo trabajos de doctorado finalmente en Madison, que es donde está. How many years there in Madison?
Now I'm about 5 years back to Madison.
Ok, 5 años ya que regresó a Madison, y sus áreas de interés particularmente y que creemos que les va a llamar la atención a ustedes es acerca de la conservación de maíz para ensilar, digestibilidad de fibras en el ensilaje de maíz, también aprovechamiento de almidón en raciones, y también él ha desarrollado algunas ecuaciones que estiman la calidad del ensilaje maíz, ¿no? Entonces vamos a platicar de un poco de eso y vamos a hacer la plática en inglés y aparecerán la traducción con ustedes. Ok, Luis, welcome to GAQSA, welcome to Querétaro, to Mexico.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure being here today, and hopefully we can share a little bit about what we study and learn with our program, and hope it can be useful to you and everybody that utilizes all the information that you share.
Yes, I'm sure of that. And you know, in the central part of Mexico, there's a need to increase the supply of forage, okay? So the farmers have been very intensive, increasing the amount of plants per hectare to have better yields and have enough food, enough silage for their cows. But opposite to this, maybe they are losing, or no, maybe they are losing starch. They say, hey, should I lose starch or I go for yield? What is your opinion and your experience there, Luis?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a dilemma that affects producers everywhere, right? There's always this discussion about quantity versus quality. And it's not a simple question, right? There are so many factors that we have to consider for that. And I honestly think that every dairy has a different response, right? A different answer that we have to think about it. Obviously, I don't want to minimize the importance of producing a lot of silage, but we need a balance, right? Because if you have a lot of silage, but very poor quality silage, it's very difficult to feed that, right? So we need to figure out for a given dairy, how can we optimize the system and produce as much as we can, but within a certain nutritive value that permits those cows to consume an adequate amount of that silage and obviously produce more milk, right?
Yeah, okay. Finally, that will be the target, no?
Absolutely.
Process more milk. And now, talking about quality, in your experience, Luis, the first recommendation is to sample and send to the lab, okay? And which will be the main aspects to see in a report of analysis of silage?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess that actually the first step is collecting a good sample to send to the lab, right? Because a bad sample may completely change the dynamics of what you're going to do. So at the moment you have a proper collected sample and you submit for analysis, I like analyzing for two different aspects in terms of corn silage. One is the fiber, and the other one is the starch, right? And the reason for that is both will provide the so needed energy that the cows require to produce milk, but at the same time, they work very differently, and there are several different management practices that affect them. So I think it's very important to understand both. But just understanding the amount of that is not sufficient, right? You also have to learn a little bit about how available those nutrients are. And that's where some of the digestibility metrics become so important. In case of starch, is a little bit beyond that. There is also the good processing, right? So whenever I get a sample for corn silage, Some of the key parameters that I want to know about would be nutrient concentration, so starch, protein, NDF, ash, and fat. And then I also want to see a little bit of the digestibility, especially digestibility of starch and digestibility of fiber. And then, if possible, a good processing score sample so we can better understand that. Nowadays, there are all sorts of metrics that we can use, right? And I'm guilty of that too, because I developed some of those metrics. Mm-hmm. And like, for example, the milk per ton, which your clients may be familiar with, but I think we need to have a detailed sample so we can make informed decisions. We need to look to different aspects to make sure we are making the correct decisions.
Okay. Yeah. I like milk 2024. Yeah. To see that, because in one single metrics, you can figure out about the quality of the corn silage. Will you explain us briefly what is in that formula of milk 2024 that you developed?
There are a lot of things, so I'll try to simplify that, okay. Right? I think that the most important concept for us with the milk per ton or the milk 2024 is that we are trying to estimate milk production based on the nutritive value of a silage sample, right? So basically, the factors that we account the most would be the nutrient composition and some of the digestibility metrics, as I just described. The most important for the 2024 will be starch and NDF concentration, in starch digestibility 7 hours, NDF digestibility 30 hours, and undigestible NDF 240 hours, which is basically a proxy for lignin, right? For those that analyze lignin in the past. Mm-hmm. So basically what we do is we use those factors to predict the energy value based on some of the NRC, or now it's called NASEN, right? Mm-hmm. Equations. So we use some of those equations and then we predict what the milk production will be. This is actually a tool that Wisconsin developed, I'm going to say more than 30 years ago. Okay. And this was an educational tool which had the goal of, an educational goal of summarizing, as you said, a lot of different values into one number to help the farmers to make a more informed decision. And is actually widely used. Obviously, it's not perfect, right? But I think it's a number that people can associate with the dairy cows and make a better decision.
Okay, interesting. So, of course, we agree that it's not just about one variable, one metrics, that is many metrics to figure out which is the quality of that forage. Yeah,
absolutely.
And it's most important because, as you see, in this part of Mexico, Aguascalientes, Jalisco, Guanajuato, Hidalgo, Mexico, Querétaro, our main forage is corn silage. Okay, and so it increases the importance. You talk about the qualification of the processing of the grain. Have you seen the lab in GAQSA? We're making that the monitoring. You saw that we are increasing the number of samples every year, so it's delivering some interest in farmers. Will you explain us about how this works and the impact on the cow and the economy of the farm?
Absolutely. I think that when we think about starch, we have to remember that for corn silage, we are getting starch from the kernels, which the farmers know very well that that's a seed, right? So the way that the kernel is designed by nature is to protect what is inside. And our job as a nutritionist is to use whatever is inside to feed the cow. So we have to overcome some barriers, right? And the first barrier that we face will be that hole that's around the kernel, which is actually very hard, right? So basically, if you have an intact kernel, that's virtually of no use to the cow because the rumen cannot break down, right? And then it's going to end up in the manure. The way the processing score works is it's a metric that was developed to mimic the amount of silage that has the starch below 4.75 millimeters, which is basically a kernel that's broken into 4 pieces, right? It's not perfect, but it works quite well. Why do we want that? Because at the moment the kernel is broken, the starch that is inside is exposed and is available for digestion. Not 100%, but it helps the cow, or more important, help the bacteria inside the cow to have access to that starch, right? That's why I think that's a very important number, because if your processing numbers are very low, it means that the proportion of starch that you have available for digestion is lower. Mm-hmm. And then basically you may think that you are feeding a lot of starch, but in reality, the cow cannot use that, and that's going to end up in the manure, and the cow is not going to extract the energy from that corn grain.
Okay. And of course, this it should be preventive, no? When you are making your silage to measure how well it's processed.
Absolutely. I think the corn silage processing score metric is for you to keep your benchmarks and make sure you understand how that works. But you're not going to make decisions this year based on that, right? Whenever you are harvesting silage, you have to be there. You have to pay very close attention to the samples, and you have to adjust your management during that time. Otherwise, only next year, right? At least for us in Wisconsin, is only one harvest per year. So there's not much we can do about that. So my suggestion is whenever you're harvesting silage, pay close attention to your samples. Make sure there are no intact kernels. There are different ways of measuring that in the field, right? And then later you can combine those different metrics with the corn silage processing score and start adjusting for future years, right? Yeah. So don't underestimate the importance of processing at the time of harvest, because you are going to pay the price for the entire year.
Yeah, yeah. And this will be related to fecal starch, okay? Which will be the value that we will be glad to find in the fecal? You say 0%, okay? No, which will be the maximum amount of starch in fecal, and then which are, in your experience, the problems related to find that high starch in fecal?
So fecal starch is a number that we use to see overall starch digestibility, right? So whenever you measure fecal starch, you may figure out you have a problem, but you don't know what the problem is. So after you identify the problem, you will have to go through some of the ingredients and identify what's going on, right? The number I suggest today for fecal starch is 3%. I think is an achievable number in a very good metric. Okay, I think if you are above 3%, you have to start looking into your different feed ingredients to see where there is an issue. If you're below 3%, I think you're doing a good job. Of course, that, as you said, 0% is the ideal, right? But let me tell you this, I don't think you can reach 0%. Okay, I know that because I think that our university dairy does a very good job with starch, and we often have 1 to 2%. And we can see that the digestibility are very high. So I think less than 3%, I think you're doing an excellent job. If you're above 3%, you have to start digging for the other ingredients, right? The most common issue is corn silage processing.
Okay.
So that's the easiest one to find, right? Mm-hmm. Why is that? Well, if you're working in the dairy and you are just observing the cow's manure, you may see some intact kernels, right?
Yeah.
That's the easiest diagnostics ever, right? The hardest way to solve the problem as well, because you have to wait until the next harvest, right?
Yeah.
But that will be the most common.
Okay.
But that's not the only issue, right? Because if you think about the dairy cow diet, we often have starch from corn silage. You may have some form of corn grain, right? It could be dry ground corn or sting flake. In Wisconsin, we use a lot of high moisture corn. So you have to observe those ingredients as well. The most common error associated with those would be either particle size, if you have a coarsely ground dry ground corn, or issues with the flaking, right? If the flaking is not at a good density, you may lose a lot of that in terms of digestibility. And then at the moment you identify that, I think the ideal scenario is to either try to solve that if possible, and then at the moment you solve, wait a few weeks so the cows can adjust to the new ingredients, and then you measure again and see how that went.
Okay, yeah. Every time best to prevent, no? Try to correct which will be the focus. Maybe larger particular, reduce the transit.
Yeah, if you see coarser particles, probably you have to have a finer milling, right? Finely ground corn, right? So that's the first thing I would suggest, right? Can you delay passage rate in the cow? You can try, but it's not easy, right? And the reason for that is you can try to add longer particles to the diet, but you have to remember that the rumen is very dynamic, right? So there is the feed parts and there's the liquid part. The problem of that is a lot of times the starch is in the liquid part. So you don't solve the problem. So sometimes people think, oh, I'm going to increase particle size and retain more material in the rumen. You will retain more material in the rumen, but I don't think will be necessarily the material you want to.
Yeah.
So you have to be careful with this approach. It may help a little bit, but I don't think is one of the ways of solving the problem. I think that when it comes to starch, the real way of solving the problem is making sure that the feed ingredient itself is properly processed.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And when we talk about grain, this needs to be easy because every week you are getting some corn, ground corn or steam flake corn to the farm. And it's not the same with corn silage. Okay. Yep. And then as we talk this morning, here in this part of the country, there's a dogma, a taboo, and many nutritionists and many farmers decide to put steam flake corn or raw corn instead ground corn. Which will be the discussion there? What is your experience in Wisconsin and Brazil? Maybe talking about the beef, the feeding beef. Which will be the experience there, and maybe the message this time?
Yeah, I think obviously there is a space for different technologies, right? But the real question is, why do we want to use a given technology? And from my experience, I actually have a lot of experience with dry ground corn, and my experience with steam flake is actually quite limited because in Wisconsin, we don't use steam flake corn.
Okay.
There are very few plants that can actually process for steam flake, and we have a lot of cows there.
Yeah.
So there are very few cows that are eating that. And we do a very good job. Wisconsin is very common to have high moisture corn or dry ground corn. And my experience is nutritionists really like dry ground corn because of the consistency. And I think it's a very good feed, especially if you can buy dry ground corn that is properly ground, very finely ground. That's what we want. If you only have coarsely ground, then I would suggest you to be very careful, right? Because you may be losing a lot of that to the manure. But I think that the finely ground corn will go a very long way, right? And I'm not trying to say that the steam flake corn is not good. I'm just saying it's not necessarily better than dry corn, right?
Yeah.
I do think that actually for depending on the amount of starch in the diet you have, my personal preference would be for dry corn.
Okay.
And in terms of what you ask about Brazil, I'm Brazilian and I have some experience with the industry there. And there's also not a lot of steam flake there. Because most areas will be feeding dry ground corn or high moisture corn. And now we have a Brazilian version of high moisture corn that they call rehydrated corn. We try to adapt everything there.
Yeah.
Okay. If you didn't know that about Brazil, it is truth. Okay. If we can find a way of changing something, we will. Yeah. And it works quite well. Even the feedlots there, they use a lot of dry ground corn, high moisture corn, snaplage. There's actually a growing interest in snaplage there more than everything else, which I think is quite interesting because it's not necessarily the same in the U.S.
Okay.
In the U.S., I think is more variable. And obviously, if you go to areas like Texas, very likely there's a lot of steam flake corn. And if you decide to use a steam flake corn, make sure you have a good density. Because if you don't have proper density, Digestibility is not better as you may think. So I wouldn't suggest that. So regardless of the ingredient that you use, it has to be good. So
yeah, we have both sides in the central part of Mexico. We have pretty good ground corn. Yeah, the granulometry will be 500, 550. That I understand that it will be okay for high producing cow.
Yeah, I think that's a very good number. If you allow me a comparison with Wisconsin, I think the best we can get in Wisconsin is like 350.
Okay.
There are very few mills that do that, but that's what we can get to. I think 550 microns is outstanding. For comparison, our dairy feeds 650 to 700 microns.
Okay. And then you sometimes will find a pretty good steam flake at the farms, but you are right. We see more variation in quality, in density in steam flake corn instead of ground corn. Yeah. And as you say, it's pretty easy to measure, no? The granulometry and the density or digestibility is quite really simple to make that an analysis and say we're going in this way or we are going in another way.
Yeah. And I think people have to be careful with those metrics because it's a combination, right? Digestibility does not always reflect the particle size. Why is that? Well, if you go to the lab, you're going to grind the sample before analyzing.
Yes.
Right? So it's the chemical part of that. And then you have the physical aspect of that, which is the particle size of the kernels, right? How well are you grinding that?
Yes, sir.
Or in the case of the flakes, how well is the density of the flake, or are they broken, and so on, and things like that. Right?
Yeah.
So sometimes we sound like, oh, that's a very simple metric, but no, the dairy cow is a very complicated animal. I guarantee you that the rumen is the most complex box you can think about.
Yes, sir. Yeah, and it's the same on the starch of the corn silage. Hey, yeah, I got 30% of the starch. But if it's not well processed, it will finish in the manure.
Oh, absolutely.
It's the same.
Absolutely. And another concern for what you just mentioned about corn silage is if you weigh too much to have more starch, you are actually creating more problems for the starch because the kernels are harder to process, right? And you may be creating problems for the fiber, right? The fiber may be less digestible too. And I think we had this discussion earlier today, and it's a discussion I have everywhere. I heard from a professor one time that we can buy corn, we cannot buy forage fiber because whoever has don't want to sell. And if they sell, they will sell the worst silage they have.
Yeah.
They're not going to sell the best silage.
Yeah.
So you have to be careful with that because having a lot of bad silage is very hard to feed. And I'm not saying you have bad silage, right? I'm just saying you have to think that overall. And that ties back to our initial discussion, right? How do you decide between quantity and quality? And again, it's a very complex discussion, and very likely every dairy has a very different need. So whatever your neighbor does probably doesn't matter to you because you may have completely different issues than your neighbor.
Yeah. Okay, Luis. So what about your proposal to increase the quality with some adjustments in the time chopping?
Yeah, I think that there are three key things that we can do, right? Proper maturity, chop height, and then good processing, right? We talk a little bit about processing, so obviously we want to break kernels, right? Maturity is a difficult one, right? Because in terms of maturity, sometimes you want to wait longer to get more starch. But if you harvest a little bit earlier, you may have better quality, right? But you were telling me that the problem here is that sometimes harvesting earlier here, you may end up with less than 30% dry matter, right? You mentioned 25 to 27, something like that. That's difficult because I don't think that's a good plan, right? Because corn silage with less than 30% dry matter, very likely you lose a lot of effluent, right? Leachate.
Yeah.
And I think that's bad because you may be losing nutrients and you may be compromising your fermentation, right? And opening the doors for undesirable fermentation and all the other issues that comes with that, right? So I think we need a balance, right? But at the same time, my understanding is that if you want to wait until 32, 35%, the grain gets quite hard, right? Which is very difficult to process. So that's a tricky thing because you put the farmers into a very complicated situation, right? Which problems you prefer to have, right? So at least that's how it sounds, right? So, and that's not unusual, right? This is a discussion we have in other places too. I guess one thing that we have to start working on is the hybrids, right? Because my understanding is you use grain hybrids. Yeah. And basically grain hybrids have one thing that helps with this issue, which is they stay green characteristic, right? Why is that? Well, for those that produce grain, what we want is we want to make sure that the grain dries down and is ready to go, and the plant is still green, so you don't have issues with the plants falling down, right? Because of wind or any other issue, right? Well, for silage, this may be an issue, right? Because if you harvest at the proper grain, it's too wet. If you harvest at the proper maturity in terms of moisture, the grain is already too hard. Yeah. So maybe we need to figure out a way of having some balance there, right? And that's not an easy thing, right? Because I think that at the end of the day, it is important to rely on hybrids that have good genetics, right? That are well acquainted with the diseases of the place, right? And pests and insects and everything else, right? Yeah. So I think that's an area that has to be improved because telling the producer to choose between one or two problems, I think it's quite difficult. Yeah. Right? Yeah. So I think that's quite important. The other factor that I think is important to consider is shop height, right? Okay. But shop height is a decision that is not for everyone, right? And the reason for that is why do we suggest changing shop height? If you get the corn plant and you analyze the different parts of the plant, the bottom part of the plant is where there is more dry matter and more lignin. If you're not familiar with lignin, lignin is the indigestible part of the NDF. So the more lignin to NDF that you have in a plant, less digestible the fiber is. So there's plenty of research that shows that if you increase a little bit shop height, it gets more digestible. You also increase the starch concentration because you are diluting the same amount of kernels in less plant. Yep. Right? So it could be an option for some dairies, right? Well, what is the problem with that? The problem with that is you're leaving something else in the field. So you lose yield, right? And not everybody can afford to lose the yield. So it's a decision that has to be done with a lot of planning, right? Do I have enough inventory to copy with that? That's the most important question, right? Yeah. And it is a trade. You're trading quantity for quality. But if you can do that, I think there is an advantage in doing that. This year in the United States was the year to do that. Why? Well, we have great yields. And we have, if everybody that I'm hearing talk about that is correct, very bad digestibility. So maybe that was the year to do that, right? Okay. So in years where you have very good production, perhaps you can increase a little bit and then take advantage of that situation, right? Because then maybe you don't end up with that scenario we just described about dry matter, right? Very wet because you are increasing. The starch is often, the kernels are often drier than the plant. Maybe you balance that a little bit too. Okay. So,
and about the health of the cow, if you increase, soil and other problems.
Absolutely, right? I think first and foremost, greater digestibility can help with intake, right? Which is a plus. In terms of soil contamination, if you increase the shop height, you are probably bringing less dust, right? Because dust accumulates in that bottom part of the plant. Yeah. Right? So very likely, and I'm talking about dust, but it's not dust, right? It's soil plus different microorganisms, and you can talk about yeast, mold, Clostridia. Name your poison there, and we will tell you that there is less of that, right? Okay. And it's true. It definitely works from that perspective. So in dry years, it may help with that as well.
Okay. So chop length, maturity, and processing. Okay. The three silver bullets to achieve for a good silage.
Absolutely. And then there are all the other things that we know quite well about in silage, right?
Yeah.
Packing, covering, inoculating, and so on. And then after you open, there are all the proper removal and so on. People think it's easy to produce silage, right?
Nope.
And I think it's one of the most difficult things that dairy farmers have to do.
Yeah.
Not that they have a lot of easy things to do, but
but it's in a so short time, and it impacts all the year in health and economy and production.
Absolutely. One bad silage season can break a dairy, right?
Yeah, so I like that.
It creates a lot of problems. And it's unfortunate because with different ingredients, you can buy a different supplier or you can ask for a change in the type of product. With silage, you are the supplier, so you're not going to change the supplier, right? And you cannot solve because you cannot harvest again. So it has to be at the perfect time of the year for you to think, okay, what do I have to do? How do I have to do? And make sure everything goes well.
Okay. Well, I don't know if you have something extra to put here in the video about what we talk silage or processing corn.
No, I think we cover most of that, and obviously remember I'm very biased, right? Like everyone else, so you have to be careful. But we do try to be based on research. So I think that whatever we are describing to you is because we either tested or we saw that other groups have been working on and doing a good job understanding.
That's pretty good. He's biased on science. Okay. Well, thank you, Luis. It's a pleasure to be with you here in GAQSA. As you see, we are making many efforts to improve the quality and the profitability of the farmers in the plant and then in the lab. And I would like you to give you the present, this white Holstein.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
She will trip to Dairy Lab.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that. I will find a very special place in my office there to showcase there. And thanks again for the opportunity to be here. I hope all the discussion we had and will have can be helpful to the producers here in the area, and that we can keep optimizing dairy production, right?
Yeah. Muchas gracias.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Gracias.